We're here today to talk about the opportunities and the challenges facing us all as we design and deliver missions. And we want a frank discussion about what works, what doesn't work, and we share that experience to try to craft joint solutions to common problems. And who better to kick us off in talking about the challenges and opportunities of mission work than Ravi Gurumurthy, the Chief Executive of Nesta. Please give him a big welcome. Ravi.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and hello to everybody. It's really great to be here. I just want to say thank you for the invitation to be able to speak to you today. I made the mistake, like Kevin did, of waking up this morning and looking at my phone and looking at events from America, which is just not the best way of waking up if you want to feel optimistic. But it did just reinforce to me this sort of really weird thing we have to hold in our mind at the moment, where it's probably true for any point in human history, someone will have said, this is a moment of great opportunity, but also great risk and danger. But today, it is on steroids. So this morning, I looked at Steve Bannon doing a Nazi salute, and you're chilled to the bone at this sight that this is even possible. And at the same time, I also looked at an article about DeepMind and Demis Hassabis talking about how AlphaFold, the great technological breakthrough that they've made, enables them to almost harness 2,000 years of, 2 billion years of PhD time in a second. It's that degree of productivity change. So I think one of the challenges we have is how to shape this world so that that possibility is fulfilled and the dangers and perils are headed off. And I think what probably unites all of us here is, in whatever way we can, we want to be players, not spectators. There is going to be change, and we want to shape it for good and make the positive come out and head off some of the big risks that, Kevin, you've already talked about. And in a way, that's partly the backdrop to why we, as an organisation at Nesta, started focusing on mission-driven innovation. It was a desperate desire to make big, long-term challenges ensure they're addressed in a radical and fundamental way. And what I thought I'd do today is say a little bit about what is mission-driven innovation, why do we think it's actually valuable, but then spend most of my time talking about some of the ways to make mission-driven working effective. And I'll try and give you some reflections on what's worked, what hasn't, drawing not only on the time that I've got at Nesta, but also some previous work I've done both at the International Rescue Committee, which is a $1 billion organisation doing aid in war zones, where I was the Chief Innovation Officer, but also working in government, both before I was at Nesta, but some work I'm doing right now. As you know, the UK government is focused on mission-driven innovation as well, and we've been spending some time trying to shape that. So, as I said, Nesta, about 5 years ago, we set off on a new strategy and decided to focus on 3 big missions. And our missions are a sustainable future, a fairer start, and a healthy life. And each of them have big moonshot goals. The Healthy Life mission, for instance, has a goal of halving obesity. The mission on Fairer Start is about eradicating the gap between kids on free school meals and the average child. The Sustainable Future mission is all about net zero homes and how we can achieve our carbon budgets. So those are the 3 missions we have as an organisation, and we tend to take 3 roles, 3 ways of acting. One is being an innovation partner. So we typically work with local authorities or Octopus or ASDA or Starbucks to try to develop new experiments and pilots and ways of working with our innovation partners. We also build ventures, so we literally invest in companies reformulating food or build companies doing speech and language therapy using AI. And then we try and shape policy. So that's how we try and make change happen, a combination of practical action on the ground with partners, building new companies, and then trying to often shape policy off the back of that practical experience, which is which is quite unusual. Government tends to, in the UK, start with a sort of idea rather than reverse engineer it from practice. So that's what we do to give you a sense of the perspective I'm bringing. So what is mission-driven government and why do we think it's valuable? I think at the heart of the idea of mission-driven government is focusing on a small number of incredibly ambitious, possibly moonshot goals. And I think what that does is a few things. First, the act of prioritising doing a few things and sticking to it over a long period of time is, as we know, hard to do and very unusual. We often get distracted, we add more and more things, and you suddenly find the degree of resource and effort you can put in is way out of kilter with the long to-do list we've put. So that's why the act of saying we are going to focus all of our efforts on a few big things is unusual but powerful, and we're going to stick at it. We're not going to assume that this is a 3-year programme. Real change often takes generations. And so having a 10-year vision for a mission, I think, has got value, but you have to be prepared to kill things if you don't think they're working. If you're reaching a cul-de-sac, you've got to get rid of it, but try and stick at it. So that's one aspect of what mission-driven innovation is. I think the second, and I think, Kevin, you alluded to this, it is about mobilising all parts of society. I think it's a big problem in any social and economic policy domain where you often think the answer is something very narrow. If I focus my efforts on improving this school, this will change big outcomes. When we know it's about the community, it's about parents, it's about the wider environment. So unless we mobilise all parts of society, we won't meet these big goals like net zero or tackling inequalities. I think the third element, which is quite profound, is a humility about knowing the answer at the outset. So every politician I've ever worked with in Whitehall, sadly, always likes to come out with I'm confident we've got a fully costed plan that if we follow it step by step, nirvana will be achieved. And we all know that that is usually nonsense and it falls apart very, very quickly. I think the humility involved in missions is to say, look, we are trying to halve obesity. Right now, I don't know the answer, but we're going to do whatever it takes to achieve it. We've got some theories that we're pursuing, and we will get smarter and smarter as we do more experiments and learn, and we're going to pivot as we go. And that confidence to iterate, to experiment, is quite a challenge. Because I think we all probably go into a meeting thinking we've got to look like we know what we're doing, we've got a plan, follow me. So to actually sit there and wrestle with the uncertainty is a very difficult thing for all of us, not just politicians. So I think at its heart, that is what working in a mission-driven way involves. I want to sort of dwell on a few aspects of mission-driven working that I think are key to getting right, and sometimes I've struggled with. One is on actually setting the right goal. I mentioned some of the missions that we have as an organisation, and we actually set those, firstly by thinking, what are the big, huge challenges facing the country, but then we tried to sift them based on what we thought was genuinely tractable. Where did we think change was possible, given the skills and capabilities we might bring? So to give you an example, on net zero, we could have chosen any number of issues to address, such as carbon capture and storage, or hydrogen, or aviation. All of those are highly capital intensive. We as an organisation, as a team, didn't feel we could address them, but where we did feel we had skills and capabilities was around behaviour change and consumer action, and that's why we focused on homes and home heating. So one, the actual act of thinking about the goal is really important. Google has this distinction between two types of goal. One, they call aspirational goals, which are these moonshots, and the other are what you might call committed targets. And those are things where you are confident you can achieve them. And I think one of the challenges I see in the UK is people are setting goals, and some of them are, well, they're not even goals, they're just indicators, they've not even got a target, but some of them are things that they know they can achieve, whereas some are like, we're going to decarbonise the electricity system by 2030, which is genuinely a moonshot. And I think that's problematic because the contract you have with your stakeholders or with your voters, if you're in a political position, is very different on those two types of goals. One is the aspirational goal is inviting a permission to fail. It's saying, we're going to go and try and reach something that's absolutely outrageous. By aiming incredibly high, we will unleash lots of creativity. We'll probably get further than we would have done if we hadn't have aimed high, but failure is okay. Whereas the sort of committed target is one that you have to deliver on, otherwise your credibility is at stake. And I think it's very important to know what kind of goal you're setting, communicate that to your stakeholders. I think the other thing for me, when we're at Nesta, I assumed those big goals would be immediately motivating. And at times, I think my staff felt they were almost daunting and made you feel fatalistic and as though you can't actually achieve anything given the size of the prize. So I think we shouldn't assume that these big goals will motivate all people. For some, it's actually a bit of a turn-off. What I think has been key to winning back a bit of engagement is to take the goals even more seriously. So if you just say we've got this net zero goal, we have no idea how we're going to get there, but we're going to carry on with our projects, then the goals lose their power to lift and motivate. We took them seriously, for instance, in the obesity mission by saying, okay, exactly what would have to change in our food system to get to a halving of obesity? We may not know how to do all of that, but let's map it out, model it, quantify it. And one, for instance, I never knew before I started this work that in order to halve obesity in the UK, you only need to reduce the calorie intake of somebody with excess weight by about 215 calories a day, which is about a packet of McCoy's crisps or a bottle of Coke. Now, that feels a lot more doable than halving obesity. When I ask most people, can we halve obesity, they say, absolutely no way. We can probably make a 5% difference, not a 50% difference. But it was helpful to go through the modelling of human diets and behaviours to understand what would it take to achieve that. Similarly, at net zero, when you actually plot the physical changes required to get to net zero, yes, they are daunting. Yes, you think, oh my goodness, can that be done? But at least you know what it physically looks like and can start to see whether it is actually achievable. So take the goals really seriously, and that's how I think you motivate and engage. I think the second point I wanted to talk about was strategy. And strategy is sometimes something that's not really liked by innovators because, as I said earlier, innovation is often about pivoting and being scrappy and improvising, whereas strategy has this image of a blueprint that is quite rigid with lots of PowerPoint slides. But I think strategy is actually important, but it needs to be adjusted when you're thinking about mission-driven innovation. So what we tend to do is start with our goal. We'll then have a theory of change. So what are the different pathways to shifting child development outcomes or net zero? We'll then often review the evidence base. So recently we reviewed about 3,000 papers on the food system to try and understand what do we know about what works in tackling obesity. We published it's called Blueprint, you can take a look at it. And we tried to assess how strong is the evidence, how big is the effect, what's the cost, and laid that all out. So that's, I think, foundational work. But what I think is often missed in strategy that's relevant for mission-driven working is defining the uncertainties. So it's stopping from, rather than saying we have a strategy, just follow it, it's saying, okay, this is what we know, but this is what we don't know. To give you an example, one of my team evaluated the Sure Start programme and came out with the finding that the Sure Start programme actually had quite a profound effect and did actually pay for itself over a generation. So if you track the children who were receiving early childhood interventions from 0 to 5 through to their sort of GCSEs, it actually had an effect. Now, what was revealed, though, from that research was that we didn't know what the active ingredients were. Was it the active outreach from one programme? Was it the local community buy-in? Was it just the higher amount of money that was going compared to the other programme that didn't work as well? And so we know it works, but we don't know the active ingredients. Also, we don't know the exact dosage. Should you do a home visit 10 times with a family or 5? For how long? So the exact dosage was not known, and also how do you scale up the best practice? Why is it one place works well, whereas others don't? So defining all the uncertainties in your strategy, I think, is absolutely critical, and then saying what's the quickest and rigorous way of resolving them. And sometimes the quickest and rigorous way of resolving something will be talking to somebody, or doing a red team, or tapping into the collective intelligence of all the people in the system. Sometimes it'll be running an experiment or a prototype. So for me, the crucial thing on the strategy side is defining uncertainties and identifying how to solve them. The third thing I'd stress is this idea of iteration. And it's very easy to say that we're going to pivot, we're going to try stuff out and then adjust and kill things. But in practice, people get quite wedded to their ideas. They don't want to stop things. It's also sometimes hard to even understand whether things are working, to get the real feedback, to know whether to change. So I think iteration is a real muscle and skill that has to be built in to all teams. And it's about a combination of skills and mindsets and incentives. One thing I noticed, we build companies, and it's very noticeable that in the venture building aspect of what we do, I'd say they pivot quicker and better than anywhere else. And why is that? Probably because they've got an incredibly strong incentive, because unless they get to product market fit and keep pivoting, they will run out of money and they will go out of business. And so you often find that the founders are really, really agile. Whereas in teams where there is less commercial pressure, you've almost got to show greater leadership to try and encourage that kind of experimental culture. What I would say is that pivoting and experimentation varies a lot depending on the maturity of the project you're in. So to give you one example, actually in a totally different context, I worked on trying to reduce intimate partner violence in Liberia. And it was a very difficult issue to work on, very dangerous in some ways to try and prototype things. We started off by trialing things with 10 people at a time, then we went to 40 people, then we went to 100, and then we did a randomized trial with 1,000 people, and it had a very, very significant effect. But what was valuable was the kind of cycle of doing very, very, very small scale iteration and trying almost to say, what's the smallest, cheapest way of testing this, rather than spending 3 years on a big pilot. So I think iteration is a great muscle to build. It's hard, and I think it requires a lot of role modeling and leadership. The next aspect I wanted to emphasize was this question about how you mobilize all parts of society towards a given goal. And let me actually start with the people side of things. I think in most public services, again, as Kevin alluded to, there's been a certain degree of loss of morale, in part because of the attack on public servants that's happened for a long period of time, actually, for decades in some ways, but even more so in recent years. And some of the evidence, for instance, in the NHS suggests that there's been a loss of what people call discretionary effort, people going above and beyond and doing whatever it takes to actually meet patients' needs. And I think it's a really crucial question. How do we get back the morale and efforts of public servants, rather than take the usual approach of reforming services, which is to almost attack public servants and say they're the problem? And I've seen every single Prime Minister do this in the UK, whether it's Keir Starmer recently or Tony Blair talking about the scars on his back. And you see it obviously even in a much more visceral, awful form in the US. But I think the really interesting question is, how do we lead the people who we're working with in new ways? So AI, I think, is an interesting opportunity here to have a big conversation with our staff rather than just be in kind of broadcast mode. For instance, it is possible now to interview 1,000 teachers, immediately synthesize the findings, and then engage with that content back to those people, and then create a conversational loop. And I think we are going to start to see leaders thinking about how they lead movements rather than just lead organizations. And we're playing around with some of that. I think the other interesting area is the role of deliberative democracy. So in many of the big missions that we're talking about, if you take net zero, we will not achieve net zero without the public being accepting of new infrastructure, of what it's doing, of changes to their homes, potentially change their bills. If we try and do this entirely by stealth, I think we will come unstuck. So how do we construct ways of engaging citizens so that they are not approached first by the most extreme people who are denying the need to tackle climate change, but they're engaged properly. And I think that the doing things in an entirely technocratic way is not possible given the current context. I think the other aspect of shaping systems is how do you create the confidence in a new net zero vision so that every single aspect of that system can act and invest. So how can a supply chain company invest? How can an energy company invest? How can somebody who's training people for those jobs invest? And that's where institutions, whether it's regional, local or national, providing a clear vision and then putting in place instruments that de-risk investment are absolutely crucial. I think that's very possible on something like net zero, where we have to be quite directive, otherwise we're not going to make the changes required. It's much harder in areas of technological change which are in flux, like AI, where I think we have to be more agile and anticipatory. But in areas like net zero, I think we have to have much clearer vision, much more robust ways of de-risking investment for all the different parties, and be prepared to sort of take industrial policy more seriously than we have. The thing I want to end with in terms of what is challenging to get right is culture. There's that usual saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think that's absolutely true. And I've tended to focus entirely on strategy to my cost. And the thing that I would emphasize on missions is, first of all, how do you maintain people's sense of possibility and optimism in the face of all sorts of different challenges? And I think that's a really important thing. Sometimes that's about telling the right stories of progress. It's about exposing people to the reality of the challenges. I think it's also about giving people as much autonomy and freedom as possible within the boundaries of the mission. So we have a saying at Nesta, which is, our culture is do whatever it takes to achieve the goal. And I think it can, if done well, be quite a motivating challenge for staff to say, look, the goal is the goal, but have massive freedom about the means of achieving it and break the rules if necessary. And I think most people I know who I work with really want more autonomy in their work, and I think this is one way of trying to think about it. The other things that we try and mention and reinforce culturally are this idea of making contact with reality. I see a lot of organisations who are working on big social and economic policy issues, and unfortunately they don't get out as much to the front line as they should, particularly in Westminster. I think it's different actually outside. And part of the idea of making contact with reality is saying, rather than taking an abstract idea and remaining in that abstract world, make it concrete. Let's imagine it, let's prototype it. What would it look like? The sort of final sort of cultural attribute, I think, comes back to this idea of pivoting, but it's more about actually being decisive. So when we have a project, we should either be killing it if it's not working, backing it hard if we think it's got great promise, or pivoting and iterating it. If we're not doing any of those things, then we're in a slight sort of zombie zone. And it can be easy to be a little bit less decisive than we might like, because making choices and decisions is risky, it's difficult. It requires galvanizing your colleagues. But part of the way in which we make missions work is accelerating the pace of decision making, so that we're always pivoting, killing or backing. If we're not doing any of them, then I think we are losing quite a lot of time that adds up. So those are some reflections on sort of why mission-driven innovation, what it looks like and how to do it well. What I would just sort of end with is this point about how we become players rather than spectators. I think mission-driven working will look very, very different across different sectors, across different challenges, whether you're working in local government, national government, voluntary sector, private sector. So this is a framework. What I would love is if missions can become something that is supple enough to galvanize lots and lots of players, but clear and motivating enough to provide direction. And I think that's why conversations like this are really important, to think, what does mission-driven innovation look like in this context, and what does it mean to you? And I look forward to be able to continue that conversation over the next few hours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ravi. Really appreciate your candid, honest input and you offering us some challenge as well right at the end there. Those 3 missions for your own sustainable future, fairer start, healthy life, and the way that you've articulated what Nesta is all about in terms of your focus. We've got an opportunity to ask some questions, to offer some comments. Would anyone in the audience like the opportunity to do that? If you don't mind just introducing yourself before you offer the question.
Rick Delridge, Cardiff University. Thanks, Ravi. A couple of thoughts in response to some of what you've said, particularly the last point around I absolutely agree with the need for a tailored approach that recognises the specifics of context and the concerns of key actors on the ground. That's why Kev mentioned we coined this term micro-missions as a way of translating the big, disruptively ambitious, but trying to find a way to make that meaningful to people on the ground. So that tailored approach I absolutely agree with. I suppose I'm just a little bit concerned, not so much with what you said around the need for suppleness, but it seems to me there's a danger that everything's getting called a mission at the moment. And I do think that we will lose the potential benefit of a missions approach if we don't work to retain some key characteristics and the integrity of a missions approach. So maybe push you a little on what you think those key characteristics are that we need to retain if we're going to genuinely claim to be making a missions approach to the challenges that we face, please.
Thanks, Rick. Completely agree with you. So let me give you an example of where I think we should be rigid and where we should be flexible. In the UK government, they've set out their 5 missions, and I think some of them are missions and some of them are not missions. So it is not really a mission to achieve economic growth. That's a sort of byproduct of lots of other things. And many of the outcomes they've chosen, as I said earlier, they're not ambitious moonshots, they are table stakes. So, and some of them aren't even setting out goals. So I think you've got to have integrity in terms of a big moonshot goal. That's, I think, at the heart of it. Where I think you want flexibility is in the how. And I hear people sort of saying, well, mission-driven government requires doing X, Y, Z. Actually, I think you need a repertoire of tools that will be needed for some missions more than others. So to give you an example, the net zero mission is fundamentally a huge infrastructure challenge. It's about driving hundreds of billions of pounds of investment in power stations and wires. It's obviously got huge social policy dimensions in terms of the public's acceptability, but it's very, very different to the NHS and how we drive change. And what I don't think is helpful is approaches where you say, this is our approach to reform, and we're going to now fit everything into that approach. So that's where I think quite a lot of suppleness is required. I think the other aspect is the point about what it means for individuals. So if you're in a governmental organisation or a non-governmental organisation, it's going to be different, and you're going to convene people in a different way because of your power and your locus in the system. So that's why I think it requires a little bit of flexibility there.
Thank you for that question, Rick. Any others?
Thanks, Ravi. One of the things that you said, which I think resonates for a lot of us, is that citizens, what's sometimes called ordinary people, actually need to be active agents of change. They can't be just something that's done to them, as it were. And it seems to me that one of the common ways of doing that is through thinking through how we engage with people in their communities, in their practical context. And I'll just give you just one example. When we've looked at good practice school food systems around the world, one of the places that we've spent a lot of time working with is the city of Malmö in southern Sweden, widely regarded as one of the best school food systems in Europe. But when they went to change they wanted to reduce the carbon footprint of all public food going into the city, and they wanted to do it quickly. And one of the ways they did it was removing the meat. Not entirely, but removing meat. Then there was an enormous backlash from parents who accused the city of feeding their children what they called protein-free food. And this freaked the city out because they realized that parents didn't seem to understand protein. And the way they did it, instead of giving paternalistic lectures, they invited parents in different communities to come in and sample the new menus, and then to discuss protein, and then to have a balance between plant-based, meat-based protein. And this has got to be the way of the world, it seems to me, in the sense that more plant-based menus are cheaper, they're healthier, and they're more climate-friendly. And that triple dividend is going to be secured in this way. But the key point was about engaging in new, non-paternalistic ways. Could you comment on that, please? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's extremely critical, particularly if you take any of the big system transitions we're talking about, like food or net zero, we will face a huge backlash unless we engage in a careful way. I think one of my regrets, actually, from sort of political perspective for a second, is that the language of empowerment and control was sort of weaponized by the right. And actually, progressives have been talking about empowerment and deliberation and citizen engagement for decades, but have never quite managed to do it in a potent a way as the right now has. And I think, again, this is an example where I think it will look different in different sectors and different places. I think the most hyper-local engagement is often the most valuable. So let me give you an example of something we're working on at the moment where we're replicating a trial in about 500 schools where we're co-creating an anti-bullying campaign with young people. And this is based on an American trial where it was shown that if you try to sort of do it in a more didactic way and you try to shift norms around violence, often it doesn't work. But the best versions are about systematically co-creating and co-producing an intervention with young people. Lots of that sort of stuff happens, but doing it in a systematic, careful way as a norm, I think, is a really good way forward. I think the second thing is focusing much more on sort of neighbourhoods. So the ultra-local organisations, often ones that have got more engagement and trust in an informal way. So I think we can sometimes immediately default to citizens' juries, citizens' assemblies, things that I've talked about. But actually it's the hyper-local engagement that often I think matters, because that's about just the human relationships that public servants and community organisations have. So I think the way to do that sometimes is vesting them with more power, and not thinking about joining up health and social care and education just at the local authority level or higher, but saying, well, what happens if we start with neighbourhoods? That's how I would probably try and do this.
Ben Burggraaf from Net Zero Industry Wales. Thank you very much, Ravi. Some very interesting thoughts. I was really curious to hear from you about the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act. In my view, it's a bit of a North Star, and it's a missed opportunity in many cases, because I think in Wales we still tend to use it, and this is my opinion, too much as a reason not doing certain things, rather than actually using it as a guiding light for many things. In that Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, we have 7 goals, but they are not really goals, because they're just, I'd call, 2-word kind of descriptions of what we would like Wales to be in the future. So how would you go about actually defining those kind of 7 goals and work with local authorities, Welsh Government and other public bodies on actually making that a real kind of tangible goals to help with actually a bit more mission-driven kind of like way forward? Because I think it's a missed opportunity, particularly to engage also industry in that kind of direction, because there are a lot of companies already aligned with UN sustainability goals. There's a lot of alignment between those two, and it actually is a really good way of bridging private and public sector going forward and actually creating that common purpose to deliver that kind of intended outcome which everybody wants to achieve. So what's your view on that?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I mean, a couple of reflections. One is, I mean, I think the idea of making decisions now with future generations' welfare in mind is incredibly radical, exciting, powerful, I think the question is, how do you translate it into processes, institutions, mechanisms? We were talking about this over dinner last night, and I was saying, well, one way of doing that is something as boring as the discount rate that the Treasury uses for green book investments. Should we be investing in assets with the future generations in mind, or should we just discount their welfare, as you would normally do when you're calculating those investments? That's a practical way of institutionalising that idea. How to sort of make this, the sort of, to give it wings, if you like. The best example for me of doing that has been in climate change with the Climate Change Committee. And what I think was smart about the Climate Change Act was, one, we sort of said, look, we are going to set 5-year carbon budgets, 3 of them in advance. We're going to do annual reports on our emissions. We're going to have an independent institution gather scientists and economists to make the recommended approach. We are going to then, as government, the UK government, accept or reject that. But it created quite a thick set of institutions and political pressure to do something. And so I think the key is often all the institutions and mechanics that translate intent from the legislation into lots and lots of action. So maybe, I think possibly for missions generally, we need climate change committee type institutions outside of government, well-resourced, with a lot of credibility to drive this forward. And I've seen other organisations that have been set up a bit like the CCC never quite work as well, but there are lots of small design choices that I think made the CCC work that have made others perhaps less successful.
Hi, so it's not really a question about missions. I was just really interested in what you said about the anti-bullying strategy and co-creating with children and how that seems to deliver better outcomes. Do you think that the children come up with better ideas to address bullying, or do you think it's the act of co-producing itself which brings about a change, which gives that outcome?
So that intervention was created by someone called Betsy Palak, who's a social psychologist at Princeton. And what she tried was, one, a strategy where the teachers identify the pupils to co-create a campaign, and one where pupils find other pupils. Interestingly, obviously the second one worked a lot better because they were better at finding the most influential people in that school. The theory behind it is that in order to shift a social norm within a school, you have to find the most influential kids, and they have to essentially signal what is desirable or typical behaviour. So it's about it's about the who delivers the message, not just the message itself. Now, they will deliver a better message if they've co-created all the anti-bullying campaign. It'll be more authentic, and they will internalise it in a different way. So I think it's a good example of having to give up a little bit of power because it will get changed in different ways in order to get the benefit of that group dynamic shifting.
Hi. Dan Bristow from the Wales Centre for Public Policy. I was really interested in hearing some reflections from you on missions in the context of multi-level governance. So, along with some colleagues in Cardiff University earlier in the week, we were looking at the missions that the UK government set, the missions that the Welsh government set, the missions that the Future Generation Commissioners set. And I'm just interested in, if all of them are following the idea of mobilising a range of different actors to support the effort. Actually, they're in Wales all trying to mobilise the same set of actors with overlapping and distinct sets of missions. So I'm interested in your reflections on that.
That is a nightmare of a question. That is honestly the hardest question. Because I think this is where... a digression. When mission-driven government in the UK was announced, everyone said this is very compatible with devolution. I said, well, is it really? Because these are national missions. Full devolution would involve local governments or saying we want to do something totally different. Our priority is something completely different. So I think it's hard. For me, the ideal version would be the UK or Wales, or having a very, very small number of national missions, but that gives enough space for regional and local institutions to identify additional local priorities. Now, the problem that usually happens is that the bandwidth and money is all taken up by the top down, and there's not enough space for genuine local responsiveness. But this is a bigger, I mean, this is all caught up into fiscal devolution and where I think ideally I would have a much more sort of devolved system more generally, because that's the only way you'd get that power balance where there are certain national floor targets or national missions, but much more is locally addressed. I think where there is a real rationale for national change is when things are super independent. So again, on energy, you have to think about things in a UK, possibly European-wide scale to get the efficiencies. So there are certain things which I think do need to be done at a higher level.
Thank you very much, Ravi.